I pulled into the driveway of the house I had bought in absolute silence. It was a mid-century modern gem tucked into the slopes of Oakwood Hills, defined by its floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Those walls were designed to let nature in. Instead, tonight, they framed a horror show. Inside my living room, a room I had not even slept in yet, stood my mother Karen and my sister-in-law Brianna. They were not knocking. They were not waiting on the porch. My mother was holding a yellow tape measure against the window frame. She was not visiting. She was measuring for curtains. They had broken into my sanctuary before I even turned the key. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't honk. I didn't storm the front door screaming about boundaries or respect. That would have been a reaction, and I was done reacting. I shifted my car into reverse and backed out of the driveway as quietly as I had arrived. I drove 2 blocks down, parked under the heavy shade of an oak tree, and opened the security app on my phone. I watched them on the small screen like a surveillance operator. My mother moved through the rooms with the confidence of an owner inspecting the finish on the floors. Brianna pointed at the kitchen island, her mouth moving in a rhythm of criticism I knew by heart. I waited. Time wasn't measured in minutes. It was measured in the gradual restoration of my control. They stayed for 23 minutes. Once their taillights disappeared, down the winding road I drove back. Walking into my own home felt like walking into a crime scene that only I could see. The air felt heavy, contaminated by entitlement. I didn't cry. I didn't call them to ask how they got a key. I knew the answer was irrelevant. The breach was the only fact that mattered. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for a 24-hour emergency locksmith. I requested commercial-grade smart locks with biometric access. I wasn't securing a house. I was fortifying a perimeter. While I waited for the technician, I cleaned. I didn't just wipe surfaces, I sterilized them. I scrubbed the window frame where my mother's tape measure had rested. I mopped the floors where Brianna's heels had clicked. It wasn't housekeeping. It was an exorcism. I was erasing their unauthorized footprints from the ecosystem I had built. The locksmith arrived within the hour. He was efficient, asking few questions, sensing the voltage in the air. He drilled, replaced, and programmed. When he finished, he handed me the master key card. I closed the heavy front door and engaged the electronic deadbolt. Click. That sound was the loudest thing I had heard all day. It was mechanical, final, and perfect. It was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping on a lifetime of open-door policies. It was the sound of a boundary finally physically snapping shut. I sat down in the center of the living room floor. My greyhound shadow padded over and curled up beside me, his long, lean body, a warm weight against my leg. The room was empty. There was no furniture yet, just the moonlight filtering through the glass walls I had paid for with 6 years of missed holidays, freelance contracts, and instant noodles. There is a specific texture to the silence of a room that you own completely. It doesn't hum with the anxiety of a landlord's inspection or the friction of a roommate's schedule. It is a vacuum. It contains only what you invited in. No noise, no demands, no history, just the silence you paid for. It tasted like cold water after a long run. I leaned my head back against the wall, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the steady breathing of my dog. They thought this house was a family asset to be shared. Tonight, behind this new steel bolt, I was correcting the ledger. People ask why I had to keep a $680,000 asset a secret. They ask why I couldn't just tell my parents I was moving out. They don't understand the economics of the Hartford family. In my family, assets were not owned by individuals. They were resources to be harvested and reallocated to the person with the loudest needs. And for 33 years, that person was my brother Brandon. Brandon was what my mother called a visionary and what the banks called a high-risk liability. He was a tech entrepreneur, which in his case meant he had great hair, a persuasive smile, and a long history of businesses that evaporated into mist. He didn't build things. He pitched them. I was the opposite. I was a landscape architect. I dealt in soil drainage, root systems, and hardscapes. My world was defined by gravity and physics. If a retaining wall wasn't built correctly, the earth moved. There was no talking your way out of a mudslide. While Brandon was networking in Aspen or pitching vaporware in Miami, I was on job sites at 6 in the morning wearing steel-toed boots, ensuring the foundation held. We were assigned our roles early. Brandon was the star. I was the stagehand. When Brandon totaled his car at 16, my parents bought him a new one so his image wouldn't suffer. When I needed a laptop for college, I was given a lecture on the virtue of part-time work. I didn't resent the work. The work made me sharp. It made me dangerous. Over the last 6 years, I had taken every high-end commission I could find. I designed Zen gardens for tech CEOs and sustainable terraces for luxury hotels. I didn't take vacations. I didn't buy designer clothes. I funneled every cent into a high-yield savings account that my mother didn't know existed. I saved $120,000. Meanwhile, Brandon was burning through family capital. He had cash flow issues. He had bridge loans from my father that never found the other side of the river. I watched my parents refinance their own home twice to fund his seed rounds. They didn't see it as enabling. They saw it as investing in the family legacy. That was the trap. In their eyes, my success wasn't mine. It was a surplus. If I had money, it meant the family had money, which meant Brandon had a safety net. If I had bought this house openly, it wouldn't have been my home. It would have been the Hartford guest house. It would have been a landing pad for Brandon when his latest venture inevitably crashed. I looked around my living room. The glass walls didn't just offer a view of the oak trees. They offered clarity. This house wasn't just property. It was a firewall. I had bought it to prove that I existed outside of their ecosystem. I wasn't the utility player anymore. I was the architect of my own life, and I was finished building safety nets for people who refused to learn how to fall. The next morning, the sun hit the glass walls at a perfect 45-degree angle, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the empty space. I stood in the kitchen with a mug of black coffee, watching the light. For a moment, it felt like the peace I had paid for. Then my phone vibrated against the quartz countertop. It wasn't an apology. In the Hartford family, apologies were considered signs of weakness, like a structural crack in a foundation. It was a text from my mother, Karen. "So glad we finally saw the investment property. It has great bones, though the glass is a bit exposed. Brianna thinks the lower suite is perfect for Brandon's soft landing while he pivots. We can move his boxes in Saturday. Let's discuss rent. We're thinking family rate is fair since you're building equity." I stared at the screen. I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold fascination of a scientist observing a new strain of virus. She didn't see a break-in. She saw a site visit. She didn't see my home. She saw a family asset that I was temporarily holding like a shell company. This was the architecture of a narcissistic family system. I had studied it like a blueprint. In my mother's mind, we were not separate individuals with distinct boundaries and property rights. We were organs in the same body. If the hand me picks an apple, the mouth Brandon has the natural right to eat it. The hand doesn't get to hoard the apple. That would be a malfunction. That would be cancer. To Karen, my bank account was just a reservoir for the family trust, and right now Brandon was in a drought. She had convinced herself that I had bought this $680,000 home, specifically to solve the problem of Brandon's latest failure. In her reality, I was the property manager. She was the CEO. Brandon was the talent. I listened to a voicemail that had come in right after the text. It was Karen again. Her voice dropped to that conspiratorial whisper she used when she was planning a coup. "Alyssa, don't be dramatic about the key. We needed to measure because Brandon's lease is up on the 1st. He's going through a hard time with the business, and he needs a place that projects success. This house is perfect for his image. We're all pitching in. You provide the housing, we'll handle his groceries. It's a family trust effort." A family trust effort. The phrase was a masterpiece of gaslighting. There was no trust. There was only my savings, my credit score, and my signature on the deed. But to them, my autonomy was an act of aggression. By locking the door, I wasn't just securing my property. I was stealing from the collective. I typed a reply. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I didn't tell her that Brandon's image was a liability I refused to insure. This is not an investment property. This is my primary residence. Brandon is not moving in. Do not come back to this address. The response was immediate. The 3 dots bounced on the screen like an erratic heartbeat. "You are hoarding assets while your brother is drowning. I didn't raise you to be selfish. We are coming Saturday to move him in. Unlock the door or we will have a locksmith do it for us." "It's family property, Alyssa." I set the phone down. The morning light suddenly looked cold. They weren't going to stop. They truly believed they owned me, and by extension, they owned the deed. My text messages weren't enough. My new locks weren't enough. They were operating under the laws of the Hartford family, where the golden child eats and the scapegoat starves. I needed to drag them into a different jurisdiction entirely. I didn't reply to the text. Text messages were their currency, quick, emotional, and deniable. They thrived in the gray areas of family obligation and implied consent. I needed to move this conflict into a medium where they had no leverage. I needed paper. I needed the law. I needed to stop acting like a daughter and start acting like a landlord facing a hostile takeover. I sat down at my drafting table. Usually, this is where I sketched grade changes and drainage solutions. Today, I was designing an exit strategy. I pulled up the number for a property attorney I had worked with on a complex zoning dispute last year. He was expensive, precise, and entirely unconcerned with family harmony. I need a formal notice against trespass drafted immediately, I told him, and a cease and desist regarding harassment via electronic communication. I want them served by a process server. I want it to be humiliatingly official. He didn't ask why. He asked for names and addresses. I gave him Karen's, Gary's, and Brandon's. Giving those names felt like cutting a tether. For 29 years, my loyalty to them had been the primary structural load of my life. I had reinforced their egos, patched their cracks, and waterproofed their disasters. While I waited for the draft to hit my inbox, I pulled out a fresh legal pad. I needed to do a different kind of math. In economics, there is a concept called opportunity cost, the loss of potential gain from other alternatives when one alternative is chosen. For years, I had chosen loyalty. I started writing down the cost of that choice. It wasn't just the money I'd lent Brandon that evaporated into business expenses. It was the compounding interest of my own erasure. Cost: 3 years of therapy to unlearn the belief that I was selfish for having needs. Cost: the panic attacks in the bathroom at Thanksgiving because I couldn't fix the turkey fast enough. Cost: the relationships I'd sabotaged because I didn't know how to let someone love me without charging me a fee. Cost: the silence. The hours I spent making myself smaller so Brandon could have more room. I looked at the list. I had been paying a subscription fee for a love that didn't exist. I had treated their approval as a luxury asset I had to finance, when in reality it was a depreciating liability. The price of my freedom was their disapproval. I looked at the emotional balance sheet. It was a bargain. I was getting the deal of a lifetime. The printer whirred to life, spitting out the legal documents. The language was cold, sterile, and beautiful. You are hereby notified that you are forbidden from entering the premises. It stripped away the titles of mom and brother. It reduced them to what they were: individuals threatening my peace. I signed the bottom of the page. The pen scratched against the paper, a sharp, definitive sound. I wasn't just signing a notice. I was signing a declaration of independence. I slid the papers into a manila envelope. I felt a strange lightness in my chest, the feeling of ballast being cut loose. I wasn't designing a garden today. I was designing a fortress. I was just printing the address labels when my phone rang. It was an international number. My younger sister, Megan. "Alyssa, I need you to listen to me very carefully." Her voice was tight, the connection crackling with distance. "I just got off the phone with Dad. He was drunk. He told me something." "Megan, I'm in the middle of..." "They sold the cabin." I froze. The cabin was a small A-frame structure in the mountains that my grandfather had built. It wasn't worth millions, but it was the one asset my parents had always promised was mine. It was my designated inheritance, the one thing meant to balance the scales against the endless investment in Brandon. "What do you mean they sold it?" "They sold it 6 months ago. Brandon got into some crypto scheme, something called Lunaterra or whatever. He lost everything. He was leveraged for $250,000. They sold the cabin to cover his margin calls." The room spun. I grabbed the edge of the drafting table. "Why didn't they tell me?" "Because they needed a place to put him," Megan said, her voice shaking with rage. "Dad said the plan was to move him into your new house so they wouldn't have to admit to the country club that he's broke. They were going to tell everyone he bought a new place in Oakwood Hills. They were going to use your house to launder his reputation." I hung up the phone. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was vibrating. This wasn't just entitlement. This was theft. They had liquidated my inheritance to bail out the golden child, and then they had tried to seize my personal property to hide the evidence. It was a cover-up. They weren't just bad parents. They were co-conspirators in a financial crime against my future. I looked at the legal documents on my desk. The notice against trespass suddenly felt insufficient. It was a fly swatter when I needed a sledgehammer. I picked up my phone and called the attorney back. "Add a paragraph," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm. "I want a formal inquiry into the status of the Mountain View Cabin Trust, and I want a forensic accounting of all family assets I'm listed as a beneficiary on. If they sold that cabin without my signature on the trust release, that's fraud. That's a declaration of war," Alyssa, the lawyer, warned. "No," I said. "It's a discovery phase." I looked out the glass walls. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. They had taken my past. They had sold my memories to pay for Brandon's gambling addiction. But they weren't going to take my future. I wasn't just locking them out. I was about to burn the bridge while they were still standing on it. Saturday morning arrived with the low grinding rumble of a diesel engine. I was standing in the kitchen, drinking tea, watching the driveway. I had been expecting them. Narcissists do not believe in boundaries. They believe in tests of will. They believed that if they simply showed up with enough momentum, I would crumble. They were betting on my shame. They were betting that I would rather be compliant than cause a scene in my quiet, upscale neighborhood. They were wrong. I wasn't afraid of a scene. I had curated one. A 26-foot moving truck backed into my driveway, its air brakes hissing like a warning. Brandon jumped out of the passenger side. He was wearing designer sunglasses and shouting directions to the driver, acting the part of the successful homeowner he was pretending to be. My mother, Karen, pulled up behind the truck in her sedan, her trunk popped open, likely filled with groceries for the pantry she felt entitled to stock. They moved with the arrogant efficiency of people who have never been told no. Brandon walked up the driveway, reaching for the front door handle. He expected it to open. He expected me to be cowering inside, ready to accept my role as his safety net. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. I locked it behind me. I wasn't wearing pajamas. I was dressed in a suit, holding a manila envelope. "Open the garage, Alyssa," Brandon shouted, not even looking at me. "The driver is on an hourly rate." "You need to move the truck," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The acoustics of the glass and stone amplified everything. Karen marched up the steps, her face set in a tight, angry smile. "We are not doing this today. We are moving your brother in. We sold the cabin to fix his mess, and you are going to do your part. Now unlock the door before the neighbors start looking." "The neighbors are already looking," I said. I pointed to the street. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing silently in the morning sun. I had called the non-emergency line an hour ago, reporting an anticipated trespassing incident involving aggressive family members. I had requested a standby presence to keep the peace. The officers walked up the driveway. Brandon froze. His tech entrepreneur mask slipped, revealing the terrified child beneath. Karen looked from the police to me, her eyes wide with shock. She couldn't process it. In her world, you didn't call the police on family. In her world, you let them loot you. "Officer," I said, stepping forward, "these individuals have been served with a formal notice against trespass. They are attempting to force entry into my primary residence." I handed the officer the certified documents. He scanned them, looked at the deed, and then looked at Brandon. "Is this your property, sir?" the officer asked. "It's family property," Brandon stammered. "My sister bought it for—" "The deed is in her name," only the officer cut him off. "And this notice says you are not welcome here. You need to remove this truck immediately, or you will be cited for trespassing." The silence that followed was heavy and delicious. Brandon looked at Karen, waiting for her to fix it, waiting for her to explain to the officer that he was special, that rules didn't apply to him. But Karen was staring at me. She saw the new locks. She saw the legal papers. She saw for the first time that I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was a stranger who knew her secrets. "Alyssa, please," she hissed, her voice trembling. "Don't do this to your brother." "I didn't do anything," I replied. "I just bought a house. You sold the cabin. You made your choices." The officer stepped closer to the truck driver. "Back it out. Now." The sound of the truck's reverse alarm, beep, 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 echoed through the neighborhood. It was the sound of a retreat. It was the sound of their delusion backing out of my reality. I stood on my porch watching them scramble into their vehicles, humiliated and small. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had evaporated. They had no leverage. They had no cabin. And now they had no landing pad. The silence that returned to Oakwood Hills was different than the silence I had bought 6 months ago. Before it was a fragile thing, something I was trying to hide inside. Now it was fortified. It was the silence of a siege that had been broken. The fallout was swift and absolute. There was no soft landing for Brandon this time. Without the cabin to sell and without my house to commandeer, the reality of his financial collapse hit the pavement hard. He is currently living in a studio apartment above a garage 3 towns over. It is not the image of the tech entrepreneur my mother wanted to project, but it is the reality he can afford. For the first time in his life, he is experiencing gravity. My parents have retreated. It is difficult to maintain the facade of a perfect family dynasty when the neighbors watch the police escort you off your daughter's driveway. The country club gossip wasn't about Brandon's new venture. It was about the moving truck that had to back up. Their reputation, the thing they valued above all else, was the collateral damage of their own entitlement. I stand in the center of my living room now. The furniture has arrived, a velvet sofa, a teak coffee table, the things I chose. Shadow is asleep in a sunbeam on the rug. I hold a cup of tea, watching the sunset bleed through the floor-to-ceiling glass. When I first bought this house, I was terrified of these windows. I thought the visibility made me vulnerable. I thought if people could see in, they could break in. I was wrong. The glass doesn't make me weak. It gives me a vantage point. I can see everything coming. I can see the storms, the seasons, and the truth. I lost my family that Saturday morning. I know that. I lost the illusion that they would ever protect me. But as I look around this space, breathing air that belongs entirely to me, I realize I didn't lose a safety net. I cut a dead weight. I place my hand against the cool glass. I feel that electric buzz in my chest again, the one I felt when I signed the deed. It isn't fear this time. It is the hum of a life that is finally structurally sound. I built a sanctuary. I defended it. And now I get to live in it. If you've ever had to build a fortress to protect your peace, share this story. And if you're still building yours, don't stop. You're worth the bricks.